Right, so we're just going to pick up from where we left off last time. So last time we discussed working memory or short-term memory, and now we're going to talk about long-term memory. And long-term memory is the type of memory you probably most often think about when you're thinking about memory. Again, because this is events that have happened in the past, personal events, for example, like episodic memories, which we discussed in our memory systems lecture. So long-term memory is the storage of information that accumulates across the lifespan. Now, whereas working memory or short-term memory is severely limited in its capacity, long-term memory is at least theorized to be unlimited in its capacity, meaning you can hold infinite amount of information. Now, it should be noted that even though it's at least theorized that long-term memory is unlimited, this does not mean that all the information that you hold in long-term memory can be retrieved, or that all the information that's held in long-term memory upon being retrieved is retrieved to a high degree of fidelity. Or that is to say, you might not remember something to a very sharp degree of representation. So if you were asked, well, what did you do on Saturday 6 weeks ago? Your memory for whatever it was that transpired on that day might be kind of fuzzy. Long-term memory includes both episodic and semantic memories. And just to recapitulate or re-mention what those were, episodic memory, that's memory for very specific events that have transpired, whereas semantic memory is memory for general facts or knowledge that you accumulate across the lifespan. So how does one form a long-term memory, or how does a new long-term memory get formed? And a lot of research, which originated in rodents, a lot of research in psychology is done on animal models like rats and mice. A lot of studies in rodents suggest that long-term memory is a hippocampal-based process. So the formation or the encoding of a new long-term memory begins in the hippocampus. We also saw this with our lesion studies in humans, lesion studies meaning studies in which patients had their hippocampi removed, like HO. But this research, again done in rodents, suggests that the process of forming a new long-term memory, which is carried out in the hippocampus, is referred to as long-term potentiation. Now, long-term potentiation is a signaling process between two neurons. And neurons are the basic cells of the nervous system. Now, if you've taken any classes on neuroscience or neuroanatomy, you'll know that the nervous system also consists of other cells referred to as glia cells. We're not going to talk about those. We're going to talk about neurons, which are the most fundamental cells of the nervous system. The connection between two neurons is called a synapse. So this is the point at which two neurons meet. So here is a basic illustration of this. So here is a neuron. And you can recognize that it's a neuron because it has this kind of a large body with these projections off of it, and then a long tail, or this is the axon, and then an axon terminal. And this axon terminal is connecting to the next neuron at this point here called the synapse. And this first cell is referred to as the presynaptic or sending cell. So it's sending information to the synapse to connect to the next cell. And this cell that is receiving the information is the postsynaptic cell. Post just meaning after the synapse, and pre meaning before. And so neurons communicate through both electrical and chemical signals. So the electrical signal would occur within the presynaptic neuron, and this would cause a chemical release that connects to the postsynaptic neuron. So long-term potentiation is a process that occurs in the hippocampus, and when new learning occurs, the presynaptic neuron is excited meaning that it reaches a threshold level of activation of electrical stimulation that causes it to release neurotransmitters into the synapse, or what's referred to as the synaptic cleft between it and its postsynaptic neuron companion. And in particular, the neurotransmitter that is released that underlies learning is glutamate. So glutamate is released from the presynaptic neuron into the synaptic cleft, and it binds to NMDA receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. Glutamate from the presynaptic neuron enters the cleft and binds to an NMDA receptor on the postsynaptic neuron. And this binding of glutamate to the NMDA receptor initiates a process referred to as long-term potentiation, which again is the whole process that underlies or is theorized to underlie the formation of long-term memories. So long-term potentiation causes the postsynaptic neuron to expand, to proliferate, to grow in size. And what's really happening is that binding of glutamate to the NMDA receptor triggers a cascade of chemical reactions within the postsynaptic neuron. And there's a small part of the postsynaptic neuron, it's called a dendritic spine, that actually gets larger through this cascade. So part of the neuron is growing, and this is causing a strengthening of the connection between the two neurons. So the connection is formed in the synapse, and these two neurons, their respective connection is getting stronger because of this process of long-term potentiation, this chemical cascade. This is also known as synaptic plasticity. So you might have heard of this term before. This just is a process by which neurons are able to grow. And also synaptic plasticity is important in situations in which there might be neuronal atrophy, so neurons die, for example, and then new neurons can help form in their place. And so as the connection between neurons are strengthened, so two neurons become strengthened through this chemical cascade of long-term potentiation, they become wired together. And the old saying, which is actually Hebb's law, the old saying is neurons that wire together, fire together. And this is the new learning that occurs. This is the basis for new memory. So again, neurons that wire together, fire together. And initially, these connections that are occurring between the two neurons are occurring in the hippocampus. And again, the hippocampus, as we have seen before, is heavily involved in human memory and in episodic memory. But the hippocampus projects to other structures within the brain, including parts of the prefrontal cortex. We've seen before that the prefrontal cortex is also involved in working memory. So there's dynamic relationships among the structures that underlie different systems of memory. But the hippocampus is sending projections, meaning neurons from the hippocampus reach out to other regions of the brain. And because the connection between two neurons in the hippocampus is strengthened, the connection of a hippocampal neuron with a neuron in another part of the brain can also become strengthened over time. Sometimes the region that this connection is being strengthened is referred to as the neocortex, neo meaning new, a newer part of the brain. The prefrontal cortex, I will reiterate from earlier, is a relatively evolutionarily newer part of the brain. And so we get this strengthening connection between neurons in the hippocampus and neurons in, for example, the prefrontal cortex. And so when an organism encounters something it has already learned, say something it hasn't learned in its environment, or when that organism is trying to retrieve something from the environment, this causes a process that is referred to as pattern completion. Because all of the neurons that are wired together fire together when one neuron becomes activated. So some cue in the environment causes a specific neuron, this could be a neuron in the prefrontal cortex, to activate. So that neuron releases an action potential. And the action potential is a way by which a neuron sends off some chemical message. This is going to cause other neurons that it has a strengthened connection with to also fire. And this is the process referred to as pattern completion. So I will stop there and we'll pick this up in our next set of lectures.